My name is Raymond Douglas Chong, and we're here for a special book lunch party for our book with Dr. Bruce Makoto Arnold and our other co-author or editor, Aaron Tuck from Turkey. So this book, Suey and Sushi, from sea to sunny she, the Chinese and Japanese restaurants in the United States. And it's been a dear project for me and Bruce. We're here to acknowledge this book because we're on sacred grounds. This is this place of the old Far East Café from 1935 to 1994. I'd like to talk about the book. It's a series of essays about the experience of the sojourners, the immigrants from China and Japan, from 1849, the gold rush, to now. Of their stories, their tales, of the Japanese and Chinese cuisine mixed in. But I do now duly want to introduce our main driving force, Dr. Bruce, his inspiration, his passion of Suey and Sushi. Dr. Bruce.
I'll tell you about the genesis of this book. I have a tendency to write about things that I care about and I enjoy. I know that's a novel concept for a lot of academic historians. Actually, something I enjoy, I'll write about it. 3 times a year I would go back to visit my mother, and she'd always want to go eat Japanese food, even though I wanted to eat Mexican food, because in Baton Rouge there are not a lot of good options for that. We generally went to eat Japanese food. But what I realized is Tucson is somewhat unique in that a majority of the Japanese restaurants there are owned by Nikkei. They're owned by Japanese Americans, whereas in a lot of cities it's now been taken over by other ethnicities. I realized there was a story there to be told. In this small desert community, there's a lot of Japanese restaurants, more Japanese restaurants per capita actually than there is even in Los Angeles Basin. So I thought it would be an interesting story, and I could get an article out of it. Probably not a book, but probably an article. Well, what happened is I have to go look for other articles and other resources so that I could argue my own chapter. And I realized that the number of books and articles written about Asian American foodways, restaurants of Asian cuisine in the United States is almost intellectually criminal. Given how popular they are, the fact that Chinese restaurants were the original fast food. In fact, they were more popular as fast food until McDonald's finally took that over in the very late 1960s. But the fact that at the time I could only find 2 scholarly volumes on the work really concerned me. I just didn't understand why there was a gap, why there was a fissure where I thought there should be a lot of literature. So I decided to see if I could grab a lot of the well-known, the few authors who had written about it, including Jennifer A. Lee and Andrew Coe and a few others, and if I could get at least a critical mass of around 8 authors together, I could publish an anthology. Within a year and a quarter, all but 2 authors had dropped out of that project. By this time, I wasn't going to give up on this project. I felt a type of intellectual responsibility for it because these stories needed to be told. I think still this is the 3rd book I can think of that's an academic text on this subject. I hope to do more in the future, but I'm glad we finally got this out. It was published in June, and I started on it in 2012. And it was, I haven't even flipped my dissertation into a book. That's how important this volume was to me, because I knew I could always get back to the dissertation, but I wanted to keep this critical mass of authors together, particularly given how much coverage there was, everything from histories to personal recollections to analyses of menus. I believe it's going to form the foundation for a lot of future studies in this area. I believe this will be the start of hopefully a new crop of books about Asian foodways in North America and the United States, because it's so understudied. I think part of the problem is there was just very little for people to base their foundations on, just like I had the problem. But now with all the chapters in here, that's 14 chapters that cover different areas, everything from history to cultural anthropologies, personal recollections, and sociology. There's enough here for people to read it and form a foundation for their future studies, and I'm really happy about that. So in a way, I think this turned into a volume that will make changes.
I'm blessed to have Dr. Andrew Chong here.
Well, this place gives me fond memories. I worked here since I was 11 to 21. And my uncles taught us how to work hard. They taught us how to sweep the floor, scrub the floors, and gave us very good work ethics to this day. And it wasn't work. It was fun. In fact, to me, all the stuff I do is not work at all. It's fun. The food was catered to the Chinese food was catered to the Japanese taste. The restaurant started in 1935, and World War II came, Pearl Harbor. So all the Japanese went to camp. So this area became Brownsville, and all the Japanese went to camp. Of course, the Chinese stayed. So when the Japanese came out from camp, my relatives greeted them with open arms and cheers. And we gave them food and credit, and a place to stay in the basement temporarily. And during the time after World War II, this place was booming. I remember that there were lines around the block. It's basically a foundation of all the future generation, okay? Work hard for the future.
I'd like to introduce our first reader, Dr. Jung.
Well, I'm very honored to be part of this book. Especially since I never knew what a Chinese restaurant until I was 15. Because in Macon, Georgia, the closest thing to a Chinese restaurant was my mother's kitchen. And so it wasn't until we moved to San Francisco that I even heard of chop suey, let alone Chinese restaurants. So, despite the popularity of Chinese eateries these days, Chinese restaurateurs face many daunting problems that were not apparent to the dining public. Financial success was by no means a certainty, and many failed. Moreover, some problems were largely beyond their control, such as public ignorance, fear, and distrust of an unfamiliar cuisine. These attitudes prevented acceptance of Chinese restaurants for decades. The unexpected popularity of chop suey among white patrons at the end of the 19th century was a major turning point in the mainstream acceptance of Chinese restaurants. One explanation for this interest originated in the gold mining regions of the West. In this version, drunken, hungry white miners descended upon a Chinese restaurant late one evening, demanding food. Now, the cook had run out of food by the end of the day, but being resourceful, he gathered all the leftover vegetables and meat and quickly stir-fried them to create, quote, chop suey, which the miners enjoyed and continued to order in the future. A different explanation emerged on the East Coast and centered on an unlikely event in 1896. That was the year a prominent Chinese diplomat, Li Huangchang, visited the United States. One evening, when he was tired of American banquet meals, he expressed a desire for Chinese food. Similarly, the local Chinese restaurant had run out of food by the end of the day, but the cook quickly improvised the meal by tossing together a stir-fried concoction of odds and ends left over from the preparation of the earlier dishes. The diplomat enjoyed the meal and inquired for its name. He was told, quote, chop suey, which is, I think most of you know, means odds and ends in Chinese. But newspaper accounts of this dish kindled curiosity among whites. It became an overnight sensation that led many young white businessmen and professionals to venture into the unsavory and dangerous urban Chinatowns for a first-hand taste You have to remember Chinatown in those days were full of tong wars and opium dens and prostitutes, and they were dark and dangerous places. Newspapers referred to these excursions of young whites into dark and mysterious Chinatowns as going slumming. So that's a brief introduction to how Chinese food made got a toehold into the American restaurant fares. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to introduce to you all, in my Texan accent, Dr. Susan Carter.
1890s, Moi Toi Mi, also known as Charlie Toy, 1860 to 1955, opened a Chinese restaurant there. The building and restaurant quickly gained a reputation as one of the unique sites in Milwaukee, and offered a large number of delicacies. So it's not just chop suey, but it's a wide range of Chinese food adapted to American taste. And one of the things I found so interesting in reading accounts of these Chinese restaurants in these Midwestern communities is that the people in those communities already knew quite a lot about Chinese food before the Chinese even arrived in their communities. And one of the transmission mechanisms here were the newspapers, which were talking about all of these different types of foods and addressing their articles to the middle class who were developing an increasingly cosmopolitan approach to life. So ethnic food was available only in ethnic enclaves. And yet by 1910, with a Chinese population of only a little bit more than 200 and no established Chinatowns, Chinese restaurants opened by Chinese Americans could be found in cities and towns throughout Wisconsin.
Now I'd like to, as you both know, Dr. Bruce Makoto Arnold.
Well, to set this up, I need to talk about essentially the acceptance of Japanese food into the restaurant cuisine establishment came much later than Chinese food. Through all my research, I could find that outside of the West Coast, we really don't see people starting to gravitate to Japanese food served in a restaurant until about 1980 or so. Teriyaki and sukiyaki were about the only kinds you could find. You could often find them at Chinese restaurants. So there's a lot of education that needed to happen in the 1970s and 1980s. Tucson, interestingly, started perhaps a little bit earlier, thanks to the two factors. One is the University of Arizona, which had a very good engineering department. A lot of that is thanks to Hughes missile systems that came to Tucson right after World War II. The other thing that helped Tucson was the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, which is one of the largest air bases in the world. It still is to this day. So the story I'm going to read concerns Momoko Kakishita. She came to the United States the late 70s. Oh no, actually she was here before that. Well, she came in arranged marriage. And eventually she was arranged to a chicken sexer in North Carolina, so she had to live in rural North Carolina in the 1950s and 60s where there were no Japanese restaurants. Are there any there now? I think there probably are. So she had to learn to cook Japanese food for herself, as did actually a lot of the early proprietors in Tucson. A lot of them actually didn't know how to cook or cooked very little, so they had to learn in order to be able to taste the food that they had grown up with and that they were used to. So Momoko is going to open her own restaurant, and this kind of tells the story of when we finally start to see the merging of Caucasian American, or the dominant culture, interest in Japanese cuisine, and how finally there's a large enough mass of actual Japanese and Japanese Americans in Tucson to start needing some place to congregate and to form a small ethnic pool, very small compared to little Tokyo here. Within a couple of years, the Jerkwood became the only restaurant in Tucson serving Japanese food. The menu was not printed and could vary from week to week. Common staples such as teriyaki and sukiyaki were always on offer, but so too were the wholly exotic and unknown: tonkatsu, sushi, octopus, and squid. In order to add to the ambience, the jukebox was loaded with Japanese songs and played continuously. The once-a-week Japanese menu was designed to introduce non-Japanese patrons to Japanese foods and to bring in members of Tucson's growing Nikkei community. Consequently, the driftwood set the stage for the next phase of Tucson's Japanese restaurants. While non-Nikkei generally ordered the familiar, on Thursdays the kitchen help and waitstaff were Nikkei women. In addition to helping Mrs. K prepare most of the day, they were instructed to ensure that no matter what they ordered, customers fully understood what they were going to consume. Momoko-san and her compatriots also educated customers on how to use chopsticks and eat meals properly, and perhaps how to disguise unfamiliar tastes with teriyaki sauce.
Only